I'm here with Allen Moyer, set designer of COC's upcoming production of Die Fledermaus. Thanks for being with us.
You're welcome.
You're also familiar to Toronto audiences for your previous work with the COC of the Flying Dutchman, which was here in '96, and then I believe 2 years ago, and the most recent production of Nixon in China, which was an audience favorite. Before we talk about Die Fledermaus, do you mind telling me about your artistic beginnings? How did you discover set design, and what drew you to it as a career?
Well, I didn't know about set design. I didn't even know there was such a thing in a way. I grew up in a very small town in Pennsylvania, and it wasn't until I got to college that I learned about it, and I decided that it would be something that would be good, that I would fit well with, because I had always drawn and painted and made things, and was interested in all the things that a set designer does, which is a strange sort of jack of all trades and master of none, you know. Mm-hmm. But at that point, I was studying biochemistry, and thought that was definitely what I wanted to do. But very soon after that, I became really uninterested in biochemistry, and then was in a position where I didn't know if I wanted to get into designing or directing. But I was at a liberal arts school without a theater major, and so what I did was then I transferred to another school, transferred to Penn State, which had a big theater program, and then I had to choose between directing and designing, and I thought, I'll just, it's amazing, you know, you just decide these things. I'll be a designer. So that's what I did. And then after undergraduate school, I had 3 years in between, and then went to NYU for graduate school and hit the ground running. And when I graduated in '86, and it's just been, you know,
Haven't looked back since?
Have not looked back. No.
You've worked extensively in both opera and theater. From the perspective of a set designer, what are the nuances between the two modes of performance, and do you have any preferences between one or the other?
Well, I think that I believe that at its best, when it's working at its best, and I also refer to the process of making opera or making theater. At its best, I think that the process has very little differences. Mm-hmm. Obviously, when you're doing something with music, that makes a huge difference. And so when you're doing something, you're doing a musical or an opera, the music becomes essential as part of what you have to think about, and also what you have as a sort of to use as a tool. Mm-hmm. So you have to respond to that. But as far as the process goes with collaborators or whatever, at its best, I find that they're very similar. And at its best, when you're doing opera, the performers bring as much to the role as a singer and as an acting singer as when you're doing a theater piece where it's just an actor acting, or a musical where it's also an actor that's a singing actor as opposed to an acting singer. Mm-hmm. You know? But the intention's all the same, and it can be, and at its best, and ideally, the processes should have the same goals, the same beginnings and ends. You know, you want the same thing from an opera performance, I believe, as a theater performance. And I also think that in many ways, you can get. You asked me about what I prefer and whatever, and that's a hard question because I tend to prefer them all. So sometimes you can get the same kind of high from going to see a musical as you can from an opera or from a play. Sometimes the musical can have a stupid story, and it can still give you the same kind of high as something else. So it's hard to predict, I think, but I don't. I think when people ask me what I prefer, I say I prefer that I'm lucky enough to do all of those things. Mm-hmm. But I think it's nice to have variety in what you do, and so that you can constantly be. The challenges can be different with the pieces just because of scale and all that kind of all the stuff you have to deal
I
with.
imagine
in a
most of the
show.
opera pieces tend to be quite a bit larger physically.
Physically larger, so you have to be flexible with that because I think sometimes there are theater designers that work in opera that can't handle, don't understand scale, and they end up with these puny visual statements, and also just as far as purely as a compositional thing, as far as an artistic. Something you're trying to create artistically, that you look at them and they just don't have the right. They don't. The composition's not so great because it seems small and because a lot of theater, usually theater things are the stages are smaller, but a lot of times two people now you spend a lot of time in your career doing in small spaces too that have small off Broadway things or different. So you really have to be able to respond to the scale of the environment as well, which is something that a lot of designers aren't as flexible with. But I think because I've always done from the moment I started working, I was doing theater and I was doing opera. I've always had a mix. And so I think that's helped me understand that.
You work hand in hand with the director of any given piece and the costume designer. In this case, the director is Christopher Alden, who is one of your most regular collaborators. Tell me about the chemistry and creative process required to bring three creative minds like that together into one unified vision.
It's and it's different all the time. Some directors you work with, you meet all together all the time from the beginning, which is a very hard thing to do with everyone's schedules, I have to say. It's especially hard with lighting designers to get them in on as many meetings because they tend to be, not that they're busier, but their work tends to be on site, and so a lot of they travel a lot. Set designers and costume designers do more work in their studio rather than in the public in the theater in the 2 weeks or whatever before you open. So we tend to be a little easier to sort of arrange a meeting with because we tend to be around more. Christopher likes very much. I don't think I've done any show with Christopher that I haven't started with him first. He tends to like to have early meetings with the set designer first. It's just the way he chooses to work, and we'll have probably 3 or 4 discussions and sort of get the ball rolling before we involve the costume designer and the lighting designer. And I've done several things with Christopher that I've done the costumes too. So then because it's interesting, we'll have discussions about costumes while we're talking in those early stages too. But then we'll get to a point and I'll start sort of making things in my studio without Christopher and then meeting, and he'll occasionally then have meetings separately with the costume designer, and they're sort of working. But we've established enough kind of rules or like guideposts from our early meetings that it's as long as we stick to those, that's what it's really about. If you meet early enough and really drill into your heads the things that are most important to you about what you want the piece to say, you come up with a set of rules in a way, or things that sort of help you along the way.
Kind of like a mandate for that specific project.
Yeah, I mean, because in a way, that's really what you want. It's when you're doing something, you really want to give it a point of view. You really want to, with most of these great pieces, you can, they don't have it all spelled out. A lot of times, the greater the piece, the more flexibility the point of view is in it. But once you decide what that point of view is and what you want it to say, I mean, that's what we do it for, after all. It's like, what makes our production different than what someone else? Well, because this is how we feel about it right now in our lives at this point. This is how we feel about this piece. And a lot of times that will change. You do a piece, you do it 10 years later, and you're doing a new production, and you think, oh God, I feel totally different about this than I did 10 years ago, or even 5. I mean, for a while I was doing così fan tutte all the time, And every production was different. You know, because it's so much about the way that piece of, I think, is a lot. I think Mozart can be extremely personal, and so that really is affected by how you all feel at the time and what you wanted to say. And COC is especially has so many decisions to make about COC. With the end, it's all about how you feel about how it ends. Because Mozart leaves it wide open for you. He really does. But all the great Mozart does. It's the great stuff. It depends on how you feel about it. You know, is Don Giovanni really? You know, is it a really awful, sad ending, or is it hysterically funny? You know, I always thought I'd love to do a production of Don Giovanni that was an out and out like farce with cartoon like scenery. Because I think sometimes when I listen to Don Giovanni, I think, you know, he's really just making fun of bourgeois values. He's just sending it up. And so why not do it like that? Do it that it's just a completely ridiculous thing, you know, and maybe the piece would work, you know, because I find that's a hard piece to do, Don Giovanni.
Speaking of your feelings about pieces, tell me a bit about your interpretation of Die Fledermaus and the kind of set that you've settled on for that.
Sure. Well, Fledermaus it's a kind of hard piece, I think, in that it's there's not as much to grapple with on the surface, but once you get it was a kind of slow start. It took a long time but once you actually get in, you know, you always have to ask yourself questions with these pieces, especially ones you know and you've done really well. You have to examine them, because just like a lot of people, you'll talk to people and they'll say, "Oh my God, you're doing Madama Butterfly. Oh my God, that's such a beautiful piece. Love that piece." I'm like, well, it's not really that beautiful. Look at the story of that piece. It's pretty brutal. Yeah. It's a brutal story. It's a horrible thing. You know, Bohème. It's a horrible story. I mean, I say to people, they say, "Oh, it's so beautiful, so beautiful." I say, well, you know, I don't know. I mean, imagine that, like, you have a good friend, and they show up at your apartment, and they're dying, and you're so poor that you didn't have money to give them a glass of water, and so someone has to take their coat, and they have to try to get some money for their coat, and they get back, and guess what? It's too late. The person's too close to death. You die in your living room floor of your rented apartment you're getting kicked out of. That's a beautiful story. Yeah. You know, we're so used to these things, we don't ask ourselves what really happens in these things. So here's this piece.
Do you mind if I jump in? Do you tend to kind of go against the prevailing wisdom? Do you like to provoke
I like to examine the story and to say this is what's really happening in the story. And so I've never done Butterfly, but I know if I did, I would be all about making that story as brutal, because I have a really hard. It's hard for me to even listen to Butterfly, because especially Butterfly's entrance, when I listen to that music, it just makes it kills me, because here's this woman, she's coming with so much hope and so much innocence, and you've just seen this scene where there's this son of a bitch who's just talking about, you know, here's this woman. I'm basically going to take advantage of her fast, have a good time, get some pleasure, and I'm going to hit the road. He's this horrible person. And then there's this person coming in like, oh, here's this man who's going to love me and who's going to... I just find it's hard to stomach. I really think it is. And then you see what happens to the thing, and it's a brutal story. It's just horrible. And so I think it's just important to actually get back to what the story is, rather than being wrapped up in all of the... Just because it has some beautiful music, it also has some horrible, ugly music, too, in it. But somehow we forget about that part. We think about this beautiful, beautiful Butterfly, and it's like, well, yes, there's sublimely beautiful music in it, but there's also music that's as ugly as the story. And you if you're really telling the story, you have to tell the whole story. And these pieces are not just because the reason they're around for all these years is because they are good. I mean, some of these things, they're things like Bohème, you know, like there are parts of Bohème. I mean, I think like the third act of Bohème is just perfect. There's not a single note that's not absolutely necessary. It's one of the most perfect pieces of art, I think. And almost all of Marriage of Figaro, I would say, is the same way. Yeah. And actually, which gets us to Fledermaus, because I think in many ways the first act of Fledermaus is nearly perfect as well. And it's hard, it's hard with comedies too. But how comedies doesn't necessarily mean ha 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 funny. Even though I think this is a very funny production, but you have to ask yourself in Fledermaus too. Okay, what's really happening in this? Okay, you learn in the first act that what is this marriage? He's already talking about. I mean, he's going off to prison, but his friend says, "Oh, come with me first. I'm going to go to this big party. There's supposed to be a lot of dancing girls there." And, Eisenstein's sort of famous. He's like a famous philanderer, And there's his nice wife, waiting at home for him. And how happy is that? What kind of a perfect relationship's that? And so right away it opened up for us, well, let's start examining this. What's it really like? And we started thinking about, because we thinking of Rosalinda as a sort of depressive personality, that's sort of it's hard for her to leave her bed, that she's just either she's either she's medicated or drunk or who knows what, So it's a matter of, okay, right away you're onto something then, because you're examining the complexities of human relationships and a marriage. Well, that's what most of dramatic literature is about in a way, So you get into it that way, like, let's explore this, because I think ultimately,
when you mentioned the bed, I gather that the bed kind of plays a larger role in
the bed never leaves the stage.
It
never leaves the stage. It's really as if we wanted it to start out that it was a slightly repressive, almost a 19th century feeling of a bedroom. So it felt a little bit like a overstuffed. We looked at a lot of we looked at Edward Gorey, a lot of the Edward Gorey things, but we really started looking at the Max Ernst, all those collages, which I can never remember the name of the. It's there are two groups of them. They're very famous. They were done in the 20s and 30s, I think, where he took Victorian engravings and collaged them all together. So they're to make these surreal images. And so there'll be a person in a tail suit with like a falcon head or a hawk's head, or there'll be bats flying through the. Because we looked up early on. We started thinking about, what is it? What's the symbology of a bat? What does it mean? And with the exception of the Native American culture, who find bat to be a positive, like especially if you dream of a bat. If you're an American Indian and you dream of a bat, it has a positive. There's something positive about it, But that's the only culture in the entire world that feels that way. Everyone else, when you look up as far as dreams and dreaming of a bat, what that means, it's always horrible. I mean, it's like and really sort of sexual and dangerous. There's all the vampiric images to go with bats. So that was interesting. That got us off on this whole thing about dreams, and is she maybe, is she does she have a dream about a bat? And then we started thinking a lot about, what about if it's sort of Freudian? If there's a sort of, is Dr. Falke, is he maybe her doctor? And then because Falke is also in charge of the whole, he organizes the whole sort of party and stuff to sort of take revenge on her husband for a trick he played on him a while ago. And so that's the whole plot of the thing. It's like Dr. Falke, because he was humiliated because after a party, Eisenstein left him to get home on his own, and he was in full costume as a bat, and so he was like taunted by the townspeople and stuff walking home. So it's as a revenge for that, he sets this whole party up where he gets Eisenstein to come, make sure that his wife comes as well, so she sees that he's philandering. I mean, it's a really sort of nasty. I mean, it was like, wow, Falke was really embarrassed and upset with what happened with this little thing. But that's his revenge. And at the end of the piece, when you realize when Eisenstein says, "Oh, forgive your Gabrielle," blaming on the champagne. Well, I don't know. Is that really a healthy? I mean, like if your wife, if this was what happened with you and your girlfriend or your wife or whatever, and then you see that he's philandering with all these women and stuff, and then he says, "Oh, forgive me, it was just the champagne. I mean, come on, how healthy is that? I mean,
Yeah.
and so at the end of this production, you'll see that it's not like she's like, oh, sure, okay, great, let's move on. That's not the reaction. She basically is like, well, up yours, buddy. I'm not forgiving a thing at the end of this. And so it's a much more serious, you can look at these pieces you just look at them like, well, how would I behave? How would you behave? And you start to explore them in ways that are much more interesting. And so I think that this can potentially, this will be a different production for people who know it well. For people who don't know it well, they'll just think that it's like this all the time. But I think that because it's not a piece that people are that precious about or proprietary about, I hope that people aren't like up in arms like they would be with a production of, doing one of the beloved things you can't touch, like, oh, you have to. Don't mess with my butterfly or my bohème, my Rigoletto or something. It's like, oh, don't do that,
I guess we'll find out on opening night.
I guess we will. Yeah. Yes.
You mentioned Max Ernst and Edward Gorey as influences of this piece. The photos that I've seen are what few there are. It almost looks like there's a kind of also a Busby Berkeley
we went all over the place because we thought, well, the 20s, it was almost we started out by looking at all of the movie musicals of Ernst Lubitsch, and we watched a lot of those, and which got us into Busby Berkeley, and specifically one day we went on YouTube and watched, because we all were like, oh, remember it was, and we were all together too. It was Paul and Constance and me and Christopher, all four of us. We were like, oh, let's watch
the costume designer,
and Paul the lighting designer, and we're like, oh, remember I forget who brought it up. Remember a Pretty Girl Is Like a Melody, which is, I forget which it was. It's maybe from one of the Gold Diggers movies of Busby Berkeley. So we just went on YouTube and watched the segments, which is an amazing set. It's this amazing structure. It's like a big, almost like if there was a Greek column with flutes and stuff that had a ramp cut into the side of it that went to the heavens and sort of corkscrewed up. And then there's a big chiffon curtain above it that keeps turning, and it's an amazing thing. I don't know exactly how they did it, and that certainly affected. Because that's how our staircase came into being. Because I had this idea about doing this big curved staircase that reminded me a little bit about that number. So there are influences in that. I
guess a little bit of light, and a little bit of dark.
A little light and a little dark, and also a little. We're jumping a little bit in period, but on the other hand, I believe that there was a lot of research that I looked at of the Viennese secessionist art and the Wiener Werkstätte really were important in the development of Art Deco, and so even if you say that we were doing this as a strictly period, and we were in this sort of pre-World War I kind of world, there are things about what that set looks like that could probably be supported by real interiors or architecture, either at that time or within that. Certainly in the latter period of the secessionist or the Wiener Werkstätte movement, I bet you could find a staircase that looked very similar to what we have. So, and I know because there were sources that I looked at. So it's an interesting thing. It's pushed a bit, but it's not totally out of reason. And if you think too that in many ways it's out of to a certain extent it's out of her imagination, Rosalinda's imagination too. That all sort of works, but. And for us, but we watched a lot. The Ernst Lubitsch movies are just fantastic, and then it's natural to then make a progression from those to Busby Berkeley.
You alluded to this earlier that a lot of operatic productions now veer away from literal stagings of the libretto. What might be said to be like a 17th century Sicily is brought up into 20th century Argentina or something like that. Given that new flexibility, how do you choose to bring symbolism, or how do you go about communicating emotional or narrative themes of the piece via the set design? What are some of the techniques?
Well, I think the honest way of doing it is you decide what you want the piece to say, and then you say, well, what period or time in history, or is there no period or time in history? Is there a period that better illustrates or makes it easier for me to communicate that idea? And sometimes you say, you know what, no, there's no better period to do so-and-so. There's no better period to do Tosca than 1812 or whatever that's supposed to be written, somewhere in there, in the early 19th century. Sometimes you say, you know, what I want to say about Tosca is basically there's no better way to do it than to keep it in its period and to not shift it around. You know, Tosca is a tricky one to move around. But sometimes you can say, no, wait a second, I think that I can let people know better about, because most people aren't very well versed in the Napoleon and war, what the war, what the struggle is that's happening in the beginning of Tosca and what they're talking about. Most people have no idea what they're talking about. Even Italians with Italian history don't even know. It's like I don't get it. We know there's some sort of thing going on, but you don't have a sense of politically Cavaradossi, and is he clearly he's a good guy and Scarpi's a bad guy, but you don't have any of the subtleties of that story to understand it. So sometimes you might say, well, gee, that's much better to think of in terms of like, let's make it a fascist Tosca. Let's make let's try to link up Scarpia with the Mussolini or the fascist movement, which makes total sense. And then everyone goes, oh, I understand the fascists. I get what the fascists were about. I understand that there's no way that you can think Scarpia is a good guy. And I understand that Cavaradossi, even as an Italian nobleman, is trying to prevent a social disaster with going, with supporting the fascists and what that's about. And that enriches the performance a lot. Understanding these things really can influence what you know about the characters. So I think that's what's important. And people think, we just put these things in different periods just for our own edification. It's just not true at all. It's very hard to do an opera, any production, and to reinterpret these pieces. But we all think long and hard about it. I don't think anyone makes just quick cavalier discussions about and decisions about these things. And I think that we're really just trying to make it so more people more clearly understand the details of the. And a lot of times people will say, "Oh, these people that are doing this production, they don't care about the story or trying to." And they couldn't be farther from wrong. In a way, we're obsessed with the story, but we're obsessed with trying to tell it really clearly. Because everyone that comes to the opera doesn't have has not had the same history with a piece as another person might have. There's somebody that might have been listening to Traviata ever since they're 8 years old, and they have 40 recordings of it, and they could tell you every single note, and whatever. And they're the ones that don't want anything changed with it. And for those people, I would often say, well, maybe, maybe you should just stay home and listen to it then, because you don't really need to see it anymore. But there are people who are interested in seeing it as well, and who don't know it as well as you do. And they don't know all the subtleties. Not that there are a lot of subtleties in like Traviata, frankly, but there are pieces that have a lot of subtleties, and why not try to make it clear to most of the people that are in there? But it's usually the people who are the ones that are very familiar with something. They're the sticklers. They're the people, and oddly enough, it's for something, an art form that they love. That what they support and encourage is a behavior that's basically working towards nullifying or obliterating the art form. Because once it becomes, as Peter Brook said, deadly, once it becomes that it's just a museum piece and done in a way without any modern resonances and whatever, and things that don't mean anything to anybody. Because Peter Brook basically, to paraphrase, said, if you let a piece speak for itself, chances are it won't say anything. And so Peter Brooks felt that he coined the term deadly art. And what happens with, which I think is part of a problem with like a lot of dance, I think, in the world. I think ballet is sometimes there's some problems because it's museum-like, and there are certain people that like that, but the people like that are dwindling, and soon there may not be.
Yeah.
It's just going to go away, and so the people that love it most often are supporting a behavior that is basically supporting its demise. So, trying to keep it. And the other thing that's wonderful is, we're all going to see. Chances are, we'll all see. I'll see Hamlet or Macbeth like probably 3 or 4 times in our life.
Mm-hmm.
We'll see Rigoletto 4 or 5 times. Why shouldn't it be different every time?
Exactly.
Why does it want to be the same? If you want it to be the same, get a videotape and stay home and watch it.
One last very brief question for you. Are there any plays or operas that you haven't designed for yet that are on your bucket list?
Yes, Der Freischütz.
Amazing.
It's funny because I was just talking about that. Christopher and I were talking about the other day because we were thinking that COC should produce Der Freischütz. It's one of my favorite pieces in the world, and and hard opera to do, but it's one of the most gorgeous scores there is, and I think I would love to do it.
And you may be interested to know there was actually an adaptation of it called The Black Rider with a score by
It's one of
Tom
my
Waits.
favorite. Did you ever see it?
Yes.
Because I remember seeing that production, was it 20 years ago?
Mm-hmm.
Bam. And that's one of my top 5 theater experiences in my life, seeing The Black Rider. Where'd you see it?
Here in Toronto.
Yeah.
I don't recall the name of the company, but it was outstanding and sold out every show.
Well, that original production was phenomenal.
Mm-hmm.
Then there was a production done at ACT in San Francisco with Marion Faithfull. I think they did it did the one you saw, was it mostly in English, or was
it
it?
was all.
Because the original production from Natalia in Hamburg was sort of in this kind of like pidgin German and pidgin English. It was so fantastic. I can't tell you the way it was performed was brilliant. And I wish there was a recording of that performance too, because all there is, as far as I know, is the Tom Waits recording of it,
Mm-hmm.
which I have and listen to often. But I wish there was a performance by that company.
Yeah.
That's somebody should do this. Somebody should produce Freischütz and Black Rider in
Double
rep.
bill.
In rep, or just one night you come see one and the other. But that's an amazing piece, Black Rider. I often say if I won the lottery, was a millionaire billionaire, that I'd love to produce it. I'd love to produce a Broadway production of the original production, to produce it on Broadway.
Mm-hmm.
And because that was when that was at Brooklyn Academy of Music, which was like within a year after we made it at Natalia, that was like you could not. I remember going to see. Did I see a dress rehearsal, and then I had already bought tickets too. But you couldn't get. I mean, there was a frenzy in New York for that when that opened. It was outrageous, and I don't know why it was never brought back. Yeah.
You might be the one to do it.
I doubt it. I don't know how I'm going to be a millionaire. I don't buy lottery tickets often enough,
Fingers
Fingers crossed.
crossed.
It would happen, yeah. So
Well, thank you so much for your
Sure,
time.
sure.